kind of feels like a new railway baron in a way, because we're going to end up in a circumstance where, once again, only the major tech companies are going to be in the position to have the infrastructure to be able to facilitate these kind of businesses. And it makes it almost impossible for other businesses to be able to compete in the long run.
Welcome to Burning Platforms, exploring the politics of technology, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week, we look at a new Senate report into the adoption of AI in Australia with the committee chair, Senator Tony Sheldon. But first, our regular wrap of the latest news, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Well, welcome into the virtual room for the last time this year. It feels like we're crawling to the finish line, but it's great to have our regular panellists. Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea. Hi, Lizzie.
Hi, Peter.
And the great Dan Stinton, CEO of Health Engine. Hi, Dan.
G'day, Peter.
And after a grueling final week of federal parliament, we're really happy to have Senator Tony Sheldon, who amongst many fine acts chaired a select committee on adopting AI, which we'll dig into with our deep dive in the second half of this episode. Now, Tony's been at the forefront of organising workers in the face of big tech, and I've been looking forward to getting a chance to have him on the podcast for a while. So here we are, and hi, Tony.
Great to see you, Pete. Really pleasure to join you all.
So let's start off on theme, Lizzie. There's actually been some good news in Australia in the workplace around technology and surveillance. So tell us about it.
This is such great news. So if you've been going to Woolworth lately, which in our household we haven't, but I'm sure people have, they will have noticed that the supermarket shelves were bare. And that's because a large number of workers, more than 1,500 at three different distribution centres for Woolworths in Victoria, went on strike. And it has been a successful strike. It's just resolved, which has involved pay rises for workers, but also some really interesting wins in respect of surveillance in the workplace. So one of the controversial things about the distribution centre down in Dandenong was that it involved a form of automated management. Often when we talk about robots eating all the jobs, the assumption is that they will eat kind of low-skilled jobs as they're currently classified. But the reality is often it's management that gets automated the fastest. And this is what's occurred here. So workers were required to work in a setting where they were picking and collating online orders, and they were required to meet a threshold of compliance with the orders they were picking of 100%. And this had been introduced a little while back. There's some great coverage by Ariel Bogle about this. And it was perceived as a goal, not necessarily a target. So this was put on the table by the workers going on strike to say that that kind of compliance rate is dangerous, unfair. It doesn't accommodate workers' different capabilities that might be legitimate grounds of protection from discrimination, but also it was dangerous. It can cause injuries. It can cause people to rush. There are all sorts of ways in which it might not be physically possible to fulfill an automated system or comply with an automated system in that way. So for a variety of reasons, it looked a lot like what you'd see in many Amazon warehouses in the US that have been extremely controversial. And I think it's really encouraging to see the union put this fair and square on the table and be successful in resisting this automated form of management, because it is not just dangerous, I also think it's quite dehumanising. It really takes away some of the dignity of doing this kind of work. And I think there's going to be continuing tensions around this form of surveillance that comes with sophisticated algorithms designed to speed up the process of making these orders and deliveries and the like. And there will be a role to play, I think, in unions resisting that and putting people at the centre of these employment processes instead of machines. So I'm really encouraged by that. It cost the company $140 million. It took them a long time to resolve. I think it felt pretty harsh for them because they were dealing with empty shelves for a long time. So I think the union should be pleased with this outcome.
Yeah, you've negotiated your share of EBAs in your time, Tony. How hard is it to get guardrails that is effectively imposing some obligations on the way that technological change is going to be brought in?
Oh, wow, Peter, it's a really good question because it is extremely difficult. For those out there that will remember back to Australia Reconstructed, which goes right back to the 80s, there was attempts to look at new technology coming into industry and how the take-up would be discussed with the workforce. I might add it had some success in places, but it sort of went by the wayside. And now when you get to the use of algorithms and AI to speed up and control opaquely, certainly no transparency there, then a lot of people miss out on trying to get a fair day's pay for a very, very hard day's work. So trying to get an agreement with a company is extremely difficult. And this breakthrough decision that's been struck now by Woolworths and the workforce, and funny, even though it took the company a long time to come to an agreement, great credit to the workforce, but also I'll give the company some credit here. This is actually a breakthrough decision about saying that algorithms can be and should be part of an industrial consultation and industrial discussion to make the workplace safer, fairer, more reasonable. And I think this is a game changer.
Yeah. The retail sector is a real ground zero with a lot of this stuff. You look at the way they've changed their supermarkets. Basically, they've got rid of cashiers. It's become self-managed checkout, and then replace that with surveillance of customers and workers to ensure a safe place, because people are so pissed off with the environment and the fact it's happening in the warehouses as well. You can see what the model that they want to work towards, which is effectively a totally automated system. But yeah, it's really good just to put a bit of friction in it. What do you reckon, Dan?
Look, it's a great outcome.
As a boss?
Yeah, as a boss who doesn't surveil their staff, by the way. I think...
Yes.
No, ever, to be clear. The thing that I find troubling about this is just that with all of this new technology, there seems to be just an increasing amount of surveillance that is just accepted that is part and parcel of it. And what I worry about with if this kind of behaviour is allowed to stand and these kind of practices are allowed to take effect, is that just the norms and the expectations of the general population around what acceptable surveillance is really move. And I think, again, we've talked about a lot what happens online and how we're effectively all surveilled online, but private companies in their workplaces seem to be able to get away with things that in any other setting we would be horrified to accept. And in this circumstance, it's a great outcome that the workers have actually pushed back against not just, I guess, unreasonable expectations of algorithms or whatever else, but also the fact that hopefully this can push back a little bit about the need to just, or not the need, in fact, but just the motivation to just keep constantly surveilling your staff to make sure they're doing a good job. It shouldn't be necessary. It's not. Is it really the society we want to live in, where if it's just accepted that if you go into any workplace, you're going to be under surveillance, whether as a customer or a member of the team? And I think everybody, if you ask that to everybody, or almost universally, people would say no. And yet this seems to be sort of creeping into just into our lives in every area. So this is a great outcome. I'm glad it was a small win, but a win nonetheless. A great way to finish the year.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's good these things are on the table, as Tony said, for EBAs going forward, because even though many workers aren't covered by an EBA, I think this kind of negotiating issue puts it on the table in workplaces where there aren't an EBA. People become aware of it. But one of the things I would say is that there's an assumption that it's retail, it's kind of call centres, it's maybe other, maybe fast food workers, for example, might have this form of surveillance in addition to distribution centres. But Microsoft does have a product which is focused on productivity when using its Office suite of technologies. And so I do think it is important to remember that office workers, people who work in white-collar jobs, people like me, but the ASU represents lots of these people. It's one of their fastest growing cohorts of members. People in white collar office jobs will also be subject to this kind of technology of surveillance by very mainstream products. So I think it's an issue for all of us in lots of different settings to think of ourselves as workers that have to engage with sophisticated technology most days. And that can be on our own terms, or it can be on the terms of those who employ us, our bosses. And it's working out how you can realign that power dynamic in favour of working people. And I think that's really great that the union movement's put it on the table.
Yeah, and Tony, I know we'll go into this in a little bit more detail later around your inquiry, but industrial is a tool. You don't need always new laws for new technologies. It's using the things that are already in front of us, right?
Yeah, look, I think you're really right. But it's a combination of two things, isn't it? It's looking at the laws that we've got now and making sure that they're match fit for the new environment that we're in, not changing the principles or the underlying tone about why they're there, but making them not relevant, it's already relevant, but making sure the laws actually stand up to the new environment that's been made. And I think an example of that is the right to disconnect. Like that is actually a technology law. Like that really, in many circumstances, is a law to deal with new technology. I know we'll go on a bit later, Peter, but there's other examples of a series of laws that we've brought in just the last short while that's starting to deal with that question. I think we've got a way to go, but I'm confident unfortunately got a way to go. But I think the community is demanding, they're expecting, and they're wanting the existing laws to be applied and the existing intent of the existing laws to be made relevant so they can apply.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. Look, Dan, we might move on. We talk a lot about technology now being in the cloud, but Meta's looking at the ocean. What's going on there?
Yeah, so this is on the surface a boring story, but I think there's something in it. You can tell me if I'm right or not. So, look, a bit of background. So Meta have just announced that they're installing a $10 billion subsea cable. I think it will be the largest cable ever to be installed. Is that the right word? Put in place at least around the world.
Laid?
And literally going to laid. Yeah, maybe that's the way to put it. Around basically the pretty much every major continent on the planet, and they're doing this. I guess that it's not new. This is something that they've done some subsea cables before. I think there's one that exists that circles Africa. They've partnered with Microsoft to do one between the US and Spain, and other big tech companies that have are responsible for a huge amount of internet traffic have done the same thing. Google and Amazon and the like. But what's interesting about this is that Facebook accounts for, at least according to TechCrunch, about 10% of all fixed data and 20% of all mobile traffic on the planet. So you can see why, from Meta's point of view, they would do this, because they're effectively protecting the pipes that underpin their business. But what I want to talk about, and what is, I think, a little bit concerning about this, is what the speculation that surrounds the fact that one of the main reasons that Meta have done this is to have an endpoint that connects directly into India. And to the best of my knowledge, I think this is the first major cable which does that. And one of the things that is, I guess, attractive to Meta about having this connection to India is the relatively cheap compute bandwidth costs that you have in that country. There's cheap labour. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that is the case. But as AI is increasingly part of these major companies' businesses, those compute costs are going to be a massive, they already are a massive cost of running the businesses, and they're only going to accelerate. They're accelerating exponentially at the moment. What concerns me about this is it kind of feels like a new railway baron in a way, because we're going to end up in a circumstance where, once again, only the major tech companies are going to be in the position to have the infrastructure and have the resources to have the infrastructure to be able to put in place, this infrastructure to be able to facilitate these kind of businesses. And it makes it almost impossible for other businesses to be able to compete in the long run. So, look, I don't know what the remedy for that is, other than I can sort of see a scenario where, just like we had with the railways,
or is it just too expensive?
Well, public investment could be one, and that's definitely one that you often raise, Peter. But I think another one could be similar to what they did with the railways, of forcing Meta and Google and others to allow others to use that infrastructure for their own businesses. Something which I'm sure they would have massive objection to. It kind of defeats the purpose of them doing this in the first place. But it kind of feels like we're going back to the future here. It feels like these are the new railways, and competition policy, which has been sort of hamstrung in a lot of ways because of the fact that so many of these products are free. It's sort of easy to understand in this scenario, because these are, in a sense, the new infrastructure that our economies are going to run on. And if it's only controlled by a handful of very large tech companies and no one else, that it's going to be to the disadvantage of everyone else. And antitrust has got a role to play here. So anyway, we'll see where it goes.
It's a really good point because in a way, the new technology gets constrained by the business objectives of the companies that are laying it. Lizzie, it reminds me a bit of that horrible moment where Facebook became the internet in Burma, and we know how that ended, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, they also did try to put out free basics in India, and that was refused by the court system there, which argued that that kind of zero rated service where you get on the service for free, but it's a walled garden that is essentially Facebook products, was found to be unlawful. So Facebook's had a long time, Meta has had a long interest in India as a place to potentially experiment with new versions of its technology. What I would say is I'm sort of surprised this hasn't happened earlier. Like I remember reading about this when I was researching for the book that I wrote in 2015, and I was there's a beautiful art project by Trevor Paglen, who people may know, who took photographs of the undersea sea cables, and you had to go and identify where they were and then get a boat offshore and take a photo. And they're just surprisingly small when you see them in these photos. And it always occurred to me that this is a very fragile ecosystem. There wasn't even really a map of them until Edward Snowden made his disclosures as a whistleblower from the NSA, who was tracking where they were. But it's a surprisingly fragile ecosystem that is negotiated between countries, between governments, and is sort of ripe for exploitation by private enterprise. And in the absence of a robust infrastructure for making sure that there's a negotiated arrangement about how these cables will facilitate the most important technology in the world, and will also not allow for companies to not prioritize their own traffic through cables, this is a very significant problem. And I do wonder whether we're going to see in 20 years' time very negative consequences of allowing private enterprise to essentially build out a vertical monopoly in the stack, because they can control all layers of it. And that may mean that it comes to the attention of antitrust regulators and the like sooner rather than later. But at least in the United States, that feels like a possibility that's becoming more and more remote, as aggressive antitrust enforcement against tech companies is now seen as something that is unlikely to continue under President Trump. So I remain quite concerned about this. I think this is a real way in which the infrastructure of the internet could start to break down or become create that genuine walled garden where only certain kinds of traffic are prioritised according to who owns the cables, which is not the foundation of a good, robust, strong and flourishing internet.
Mm.
I think it's a really interesting story, Dan. I would just say I don't think it's boring.
Yeah, I reckon you passed the boring threshold, at least with us and our three listeners. Yeah. So look, I'm going to move on. Look, I've had some polls that have not quite landed. I have nightmares about 2019, but Romania's recent elections was next level. After polling less than 10% of the vote, an unknown pro-Russian right-winger called Kalen Georgescu won the first round of the presidential election in a result that led to allegations that social media company TikTok had given preferential treatment. But the plot thickens. TikTok seems to have been an unwitting partner in the cunning plan, and they've been cooperating with an investigation, firstly within Romania and now within the EU. So here's what we think happened. Pro-Georgescu posts were made by a mix of bots and human-operated accounts. The bot accounts were associated with unique IP addresses, which enabled the network to evade detection by the company's coordinated behaviour monitoring systems. The bots employed identical hashtags and emoji strings to manipulate TikTok's algorithm and amplify the content. And then they also featured videos of well-known Romanian athletes and government institutions to create the impression that Georgescu was a widely supported and popular figure, which he wasn't. So all hell's broken loose. Since then, Romania's constitutional courts actually annulled the result and called for new elections, while the European Union has directed TikTok to retain data under the Digital Services Act, citing concerns of foreign interference, i.e. Russia. So it raises a bunch of issues around electoral integrity, but also around the issue of platform accountability. And TikTok's algorithm is famously opaque, My understanding is it doesn't take paid political advertising, although the allegations here is that there have been influencers paid to do their work on there too. So I thought I'd kick it off with Tony because, not jumping into your inquiry yet, but you looked a lot about election integrity here. Does any of that surprise you? Obviously, Australia is not a former Soviet republic and we're probably not quite the same high stakes election, but the capability's there, isn't it, to cause all sorts of mischief?
I think it really, putting aside the constitutional questions that the Romanian court made some decisions on, but the observations
we're not
you made,
experts on
Pete,
that. Yeah,
you made, but your observations on it, Peter, I think it goes to a real question about how, and then you look at what happened in South Korea with where AI could not be used for quite a long period prior to the election, leading up to the election. There's been some opportunities to try to deal with that challenge. I think the real question for us in Australia is trying to build that consensus about how to deal with the political situation that's happened to Romania, some of the challenges of some of the instances of things, and it wasn't widespread. I say that, not widespread use of AI to interfere with the US elections, even though there were some good examples. We saw Joe Biden's voice being artificially used in the primary, but to try to turn people off from turning out to vote for him in the primaries. But I think that we really have to build a consensus in here to deal with that sort of question about what is AI really posing as a threat, because I think it is a threat. But the question is about how we actually deal with it without actually suppressing freedom of voice. And I think the jury is so out on that. It is extremely frustrating. I think the Conservatives have, the misinformation, disinformation bill that they opposed, it was a real opportunity to try to get a consensus about dealing with lying politicians and outside interference. I think that we've lost an opportunity there for further discussions. And again, I know that I know we don't get too much into the committee process right now, but I give a bit of credit to a couple of people who didn't believe that we were going fast enough. And I did say to them, and I've said to them, and I've said publicly, and I'm saying it again, that they should be arguing that we go faster on legislation. But I still have the view, whilst we're having that argument, we have to build a consensus, and the opposition has to come to the table and decide that democracy is something worth actually protecting, not just playing with.
Well, I think one interesting thing is that it sort of makes Meta look good, the way TikTok has conducted itself, which is, in the scheme of things, pretty impressive feat, because Meta does at least have a different approach when it comes to election time about recording what kinds of ads have been purchased and keeping a library and greater scrutiny by content moderation services and the like. I still don't think that's enough, but that is more than other social media services do. And it does seem to reflect pretty poorly on TikTok that it was allowed to be manipulated in that way. Now, maybe that's come about at Meta because they had that terrible experience in Myanmar and Burma that you were referring to earlier, Peter, where they essentially allowed the platform to be used to create the conditions for genocide, and have reflected on that and come to a different conclusion about how their platform ought to be used in times of political tension and election and the like. But it occurs to me that platforms could be doing a lot more, the bare minimum of which Meta is doing, but others don't make any changes at all or aren't public about it. And that is just sort of unacceptable in where more examples like this come to the fore.
Dan?
Well, at least this is something which is being looked into, though. I think that the challenge with these algorithms, this will be boring because I have said it many times before, even if the last story wasn't, but the challenge with these algorithms is that they're opaque, right? So we don't, even in this case, we don't really know what is trending and to what extent on TikTok. We don't, and I'll take your point, Lizzie, it does seem like Meta has done more than most. It's a pretty low bar. But we still don't really know, even in the last US election, in the Australian election, in any election, we don't really know how much influence they have over their users, because we don't really know what's trending at any one time. We've got some insight, but it's pretty top level. And, the argument that obviously all of these platforms have run for ages is that our algorithm is our IP, and we're never going to share it with the public. And I have some sympathy for that, because obviously it's a huge investment that has gone into creating this algorithm. Whether it's doing harm or not is another question. But I can't accept that we can have absolutely no insight into it, which is the world that we're in now. And so in this circumstance, it looks like TikTok was manipulated. It looks like the government of the day is taking that seriously and trying to do something about it, which is a pretty rare thing. But maybe that should have happened in every other election. I mean, who knows? The point is, we just don't know how much influence these algorithms have on an election and everything else. And the remedy has got to be, from the beginning, has got to be more transparency in what is trending at any one time and the reasons why it is trending. And I accept that it can't be the whole algorithm being published, but you have to give us some guidance on what's working and some truthful guidance at that to be able to determine just what the influence is and how much harm is being done. And if no harm is being done, then the best way to prove that is to be transparent.
I agree.
So back to one of the great innovators, you can have your 24 secret herbs and spices, but you still should make sure that the chicken doesn't poison you.
You should still be transparent that you're selling fried chicken. That's right, which is effectively what they're selling.
Sorry, Lizzie, you go.
Same nutritional value.
Maybe we should all become vegetarians like me. What I would say is that was an aspect of the mis and disinfo bill. Like, I had my criticisms of that bill. I put in a submission with others, and I think a lot of the criticisms were over-egged in some ways, but they came in both directions, that it was too much and not enough. But the one aspect I think that was kind of overlooked in the hubbub around some of the specific parts of it was the requirements that the government was seeking to impose on platforms around transparency. Also, things like improving digital literacy, which seem like no-brainers in these circumstances, requiring that they report on how their algorithms amplify content. I mean, that's not exactly how it was put, but I like that regulatory impulse. I think that is worth doing. Like, we can't really grapple with the nature of the problem until we understand its root cause. And at the moment, there are very few ways in which you can work out what is going viral on social media. There are very few tools that enable you to do that. CrowdTangle was one, and it's been deprecated by Meta, so it can't be used anymore. So even if you're a diligent journalist, you're in trouble. So it's usually academic institutions that have to spin up their own projects to kind of reverse engineer and track what is going viral or what is being seen by people in different places in different demographics. And that just seems like an enormous waste of resources when you could get it straight from the horse's mouth. This is within their knowledge, and if they are not acting on it, then they don't get to continue to operate with a social license.
Lizzie, I need to put you on the spot. Are you comfortable with TikTok as one of the platforms the next election is going to be played out on? Are you using it, and how should it be used?
Well, in the case that I'm using it through a private non-departmental address, so they can't connect to the rest of my information. But I think there's a big question. Not obviously the question's bigger than TikTok, Pete, as you're raising it. But I think, like Lizzie's point, the thing that was disappointing and is disappointing about the debate so far is that when with the disinformation bill, and as Lizzie summed it up before, varying views. The thing that was particularly disappointing, rather than looking at the point that Lizzie was making about transparency, so people can actually make decisions where there's differences, they can base it on some facts and some experience and knowledge. The debate didn't land on that sort of question. It landed on a scare campaign. And that sort of blowing out issues as a scare campaign has undermined building public confidence, both in AI, in in technology, how the technology stack's used and who's accountable for it, and the role that we play as whether politicians or whether opinion makers or state or capitalist enterprises.
Look, let's stay with the federal parliament. As we said at the intro, you've just handed down a significant report. Its official name was the Senate Select Committee on Adopting Artificial Intelligence. It had very broad frames of reference or terms of reference. You took a lot of evidence. You obviously did a lot of thinking. Like, what was the purpose of this in the first place? Where did it fit into the rubric of decision making within the parliament?
Look, I think what's important is that by and large, there was a high degree of desire to sort of get the facts and get comments out there. And we've got a very broad group of tech companies, from small startups, right through to the big players like Microsoft and Google and the crowd, Meta, etc. So Amazon. So I think what we wanted to do was actually say, well, what are some of the roadmaps of the questions? What is in my case, a dummy's guide to AI and the implications for the entire world economy and the Australian economy. So you've got to dumb that down a little bit, but make it not make it simple so it's not relevant, but really concentrate on the key points of what we need to do as first step movers and what our ambition should be. And one of the things important for Senate inquiries is to be ambitious about what you want to see happen and drive some points that should be happening pretty quickly. So 6 chapters is going to be used now for another inquiry that's being set up between the House of Representatives and the Senate, which will be interesting for all of us as insiders in the political parliamentary system. But the exciting part is that it actually is using as a basis of common language, common definitions. There's a lot of great, presentations that were done and papers put in, and I put Lizzie's paper in there too, Lizzie. Without you're on there, but I'd say that to you if you're off as well. But there was a lot of real thought put into where we should be moving forward. That debate's important, and the argument about it genuinely is critically important. Having scare campaigns is extremely dangerous in this early stage of trying to make sure that AI doesn't become scary.
You're deprecating yourself a bit, calling yourself a dummy. Do you want to just sort of share a bit about what you bought, particularly in your former career as a union leader in the transport sector, and how you'd seen these same companies operating?
Thanks, Peter. Look, I think what really struck me when Uber first came into the market, it started coming into markets around the world and into Australia. I read an article in Spiegel talking about the tech companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, talking about how they're going to actually move forward. They're going to use all this new tech. Governments will have to watch out because they won't be able to catch up with us. And we're going to set the agenda without the government, which means the community, elected representatives, democracy, having a say in how their economy looks into the future and playing a role in that. We're going to be bystanders in all that. That doesn't sound like the sort of world I want to see us be living in. It should be done cooperatively by consensus. Yes, there should be challenges about how we do it. So, when I saw this illegal outfit called Uber, a criminal outfit because they break the law around the world, moving into Australia and decimating people's life savings, I said we've got to get in front of this. And part of that, because my interest in employment areas in particular, one of the ways of beating that challenge is also making sure that people have a real voice about the systems. So the gig economy became a critical piece for me, and that way, everybody who's affected, which is everybody, is affected in their employment, whether it be contractors or whether they be actual traditional employees or anything in between, or somebody running a business. And seeing those businesses in the taxi industry, in many industries, where their economic footprint, both as individuals but also as a business, was being taken off them, stolen from them, monetised, and thrown back in their face and charged for it. I don't like that. I don't like that system. That doesn't sound like there's no degree of equality there. There's no degree of somewhere to go when things are unfair. So the report to me was a really important piece of actually saying what are some of the steps that we have to consider, and the things that people disagree with me is as important as the things that they would agree in the recommendations, because the debate really has to take place. And back again to the earlier comments from the Woolies case, that has humanised AI and its usage, and it means that there's a discussion now in a workplace, but it has to be in every workplace, and that means we can start grappling. It's like cars were built, all of a sudden a car turned up next to a horse and cart. We've kept regulating ever since then, including dealing with pollution that cars create, including all the infrastructure that's required. This is the obviously
seatbelts.
Absolutely, seatbelts. Everything from car emissions to tyre sizes to safe seating to you name it. We do it now. But I think that's the program is you have to set some of the parameters. You have to make some of it transparent, make it not simple, but make it clear to understand. And I think that we've gone some way to add to that debate. And hopefully today will add to it as well. I'm sure it will.
I mean, I have to say, Tony, a lot of the things that you've said are close to my heart because, I'm sure many listeners know, but you may not know, but I spent over 4 years working on a class action against Uber for members of the taxi and the hire car industry, in part because we also understood the injustice of the way in which Uber entered the market. I do think it's interesting thinking about the mentality of Silicon Valley companies generally and them thinking that the rules of the market are the rules that ought to apply to society more broadly, or that's a kind of mandate for which they can press forward and disrupt or, ignore laws. When I was looking at what you mentioned, the points of disagreement, I was looking at what they were, and you could sort of see that there's this argument that increased regulation increases red tape, whereas my view is that increased regulation creates some friction with that Silicon Valley mentality around displacing the rule of law in favour of the rule of markets. But I wondered if you had perhaps a less bombastic answer to that criticism about the regulation creating a dampener on innovation. How do you answer that criticism, or what would be your response to your dissenters who are making that claim in the report?
Look, I mean, I just like to make a sweeping comment about red tape and go to the report quickly after that. But one person's red tape is another person's protection. I think we should be protected from pedophiles. I think we should be protected from people that want to do harm on society. I think we do that in a collective way by building a consensus in a democracy about how that's best done. And whilst not stifling innovation, because that can be a negative thing, and often is, but also encouraging innovation in a societal consensus building way. That's ideally what we should do. So when we start looking at the differences and some of the real changes in the report, I think that the Occupational Health and Safety Act is a really great example of consensus building. It was interesting that the opposition tried to do a very narrow, didn't completely object to that, which I took some heart from, but took a very narrow view about it should be just about safety and using that consensus building approach. The Occupational Health and Safety Act has a national consensus between business, employers, workers, unions. It has guidelines for specific industries. It's within a national frame of how those guidelines can be discussed and training can take place and how you minimise risk and most importantly, actually how you build a better product, a better opportunity. Occupational Health and Safety works out how you do this safely, efficiently, and you actually talk to people about it. I think that's a pretty healthy thing to do. And I really love the fact that we've got a consensus across this country about it. I believe that should be applied to AI in our discussions, how AI takes place in the workplaces and more generally in community. And I think I was hopeful that there was some consensus about that. Certainly disappointed that they didn't quite go as far as I think it should go. But I think that's somewhere to build. Where there was particular disagreement was certainly on the question about elections. They're still trying to run scare campaigns about elections. And this question of red tape, someone's freedom to be, someone's freedom to hurt somebody else is not a freedom at all. It's hurting somebody else. And I don't mean just mentally and physically, and they're important, just mentally. But when you can say that that there shouldn't be a better way than anyone interfering, putting a law to say that there is a better way. And objecting to that, I find that pretty reprehensible. And again, back to that other quick point, just to wrap up on my point, and that is that I think we can, as we start getting more and more examples, as the car was being built, as the car was being driven, as it was going into more cities, as more roads were being built, we started realising we had to put traffic lights in, stop signs in. You had to get a licence to drive a car. We built up systems to actually make it work better, and we worked out that risk management system. We'll get there, but we're going to be we're going to be pretty argumentative to make sure we get there.
Tony, I love that approach, because one of the problems that I've got with, or that analogy rather, with the cars, because one of the things that you hear on this whole regulation stifles innovation thing is this kind of blanket need for a law to solve all ills. And I think particularly with AI, because it's such an expansive technology that, in my view at least, is going to be very transformational on the economy and society broadly, to attempt to regulate this in its entirety is foolish. But there are small harms, or not small, but harms that are best dealt with on an individual regulation basis, piece by piece, as the technology takes hold. But look, there is a trade-off. I mean, there is certainly a trade-off between regulation and innovation, not in every case, but often in cases. But to Lizzie's point earlier, I think that's more of a feature than a bug, because so much of this innovation happens at such speed that, yes, it is good for the individual tech companies. And look, I work for one of them, and I'm in that camp usually, but it's not always good for wider society, and slowing this down a little bit to at least have the debate. I mean, we are a democracy. That's the point, right? To at least have the debate around whether this is a net benefit and whether we want to be moving at the pace that so many of these technologies do is a useful thing to do, even if the trade-off is, yes, we go a bit slower and we stifle innovation a little. What are your thoughts?
I think we do a couple of things. I think what we try to do in the report, and it's again one of the areas where there was a disagreement with the opposition, they thought that we should just do a case-by-case change legislation as we go, rather than this overarching approach. That was what they leant towards, and I believe there's a hybrid. We should identify some high-risk areas, like a consensus high-risk areas, and it will be consensus building high-risk areas. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree. It means that a good chunk of us agree, and then we should have sort of a broader guardrails about what expectation is on business as they're building their enterprise. Because I come from that school where having some regulatory frame and guidelines means that good companies aren't going to be destroyed by the Neanderthals. They're going to be destroyed by these gorillas that just really want to wreck. And I think that having those guidelines is important for business to succeed. It's important for people to get confidence. And your point, and I think my point too, about having a pathway, as we're going down that pathway, you have to have the guidelines to make sure people got confidence that when things change, we can change the laws with it within a frame of what we expect. I think all those things are good for society. I think it's good for business. It means that good business can succeed where bad business will just be reckless, and pirates will become merchant marines.
I'm a massive fan of the general duty. I'm interested, Dan, are you comfortable, for being responsible for the tech that you bring into your company and what it does? Because I think, and I don't want to verbal you, Tony, and I am interested in the extent to which that duty of care exists. But if it is an absolute duty to do no harm, which is what makes workplace safety so effective, that's laying a bit on you, Dan, as well, when you bring in the technology.
Yeah,
but have
sure.
I over-egged it first, Tony? Am I understanding it correctly? What is the limit of your...
occupational safety is not do no harm. I describe it slightly differently, Peter, and there's a sense of what you're saying is correct, but the law, I think, is, in my mind, is more about how you risk manage, how you manage risk.
How you prove you've taken reasonable steps.
Well, you have to not only prove you've taken reasonable steps, you actually take reasonable steps, and then also there's an accountability to demonstrate that those reasonable steps have been taken, and why I think that sort of premise is a really good thing in when we're talking about AI is because we know mistakes are made, and also there's liability doesn't stand with just one individual. It stands with, I'll put this in the sense of a factory. It's if the factory manager doesn't train the people on how to use the equipment and they injure themselves, they're in trouble. If they take guards off the machine, they're in trouble. If one of the workers take the guard off the machine, but the supervisor saw it and didn't do something about it, there's varying degrees of responsibility. Now, if the person who made the machine put it in there and it was faulty, then there is a degree of responsibility. Then, well, what happened in the process of putting that machine in and building it, or was it the Sparky or the electricity company? Did they make a mistake somewhere else in the system? So there is already layers. So there is a stack within OH&S that exists now, and I think there's a sense of how that plays out in the real world when you're trying to fix problems, and then also where you have accountability. So it's not simply about holding somebody responsible. It's something before that. It's about how you risk manage the system to make sure it's as risk-free as possible within human capacity or AI capacity and human capacity, which is the interesting question and all that. So I think that's to me in a nutshell. Probably I don't have clear I made that, but that's how I see it.
Back to you, Dan. Will you stick to those rules?
Yes. I mean, look, there's probably 2 points I make. So just picking up on what Tony said earlier, the benefit of having regulation like that is that often, having really robust safety or actually, I'll give you an example from us. So we invest massively in protecting our consumers' privacy, and it's very expensive and it requires a huge amount of expertise, and the threat level is constantly escalating from bad actors. But we do it because, as I hope I've demonstrated, it's something that I care deeply about, but it's also something that the company cared deeply about before I joined. It would be a massive disadvantage for us if regulation didn't exist and other companies could not take those same or not put in place those same safeguards because of how expensive it is. So regulation can, it can help in that circumstance. And then coming back to your question before, Peter, I just want to make sure I've understood it. Do I feel a sense of obligation, I guess because of the disruptive nature of it? Tell me if I've got this wrong or if I'm misunderstanding your question. But the benefit that we have in the industry that we operate in, sorry, this is going to sound like a plug, I guess it kind of is, but it's true. We bring technology into healthcare, and the more the wider, the more effective we are at that, and the better our technology, the more that frees up healthcare providers to provide care to patients. Yeah. So it's not a trade-off that I get very often, that I have to make very often. But maybe I've misunderstood you.
No, I'm sorry if I'm not clear. It was more that you are an employer, you run a business.
Sorry.
The government says you've got basically an obligation to ensure that the technology is used safely in your workplace. You're up for that.
Yeah, of course. I guess that just comes back to the point I made before, which is yes, because ultimately, if there's regulation there, then there's a level playing field for us all to do it. But it just makes it easier for us all to take those responsibilities seriously, including those that wouldn't necessarily be inclined to do so without the regulation. So, but yeah, I mean, you're an employer, Peter. What do you think?
I think we're only using it to do advanced searches at the moment, but once it's more sophisticated, I will let you know. Lizzie.
Yeah, well, I did want to talk to you about using AI, especially when it's based on products built overseas. So this is something that I think the government is growing in awareness of, the executive government as well as parliamentarians. Major large language models are mostly even when they're open source, their origins are in US companies, and that creates certain kinds of sovereign risk. But that came up for a bit of criticism in the report, Tony. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that, because it seems like even through the parliamentary process, it was quite a frustrating exercise in trying to work out how companies even justified using the data they've used to train their models. And then there's a query around whether we should be, as an Australian society, allowing for the use of these products, whether that's a safe thing, but also if we can't justify that to ourselves that the origins are sound, as in the data that's been used has been obtained lawfully and in a way that is consistent with a social license to operate. Like, you do wonder what we do about that. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that. It's quite frustrating to see even people with genuine power, like parliamentarians, not able to get answers out of these companies. So what sort of hope do we have that these will be products that we can trust or should be using, or do we just have to find ways to regulate them to an even higher degree? What's the answer?
Yeah, I think it's a really super, super important question. Look, I think there's a combination of things at play. I think that importantly, I'll go back to that whole H&S responsibility about risk management. Have they risk managed properly? And that means that in various places they're obliged to answer questions. I mean, frankly, if the committee was going longer, I've got a whole list of questions they didn't answer that I would be pursuing in various forms. Parliament's going to be our chance to pursue their non-answers. I think I'm confident I'll have some more chances next year to pursue them in various senatorial inquiries.
Although in Google's case, you might just be able to enter it into chatgpt and get the result.
Absolutely. But the thing is that what that will do is, as it happened on that occasion, it'll show that there's a need for regulation. There's a need for accountability. There's a need for transparency. And I think that sovereignty, the question about sovereignty, if I've understood, Lizzie, what you're raising, that is that, in the way I've understood it, and that is that they're using these large language models have obviously taken information, in my view, immorally, unethically. I'm hoping for it to be proven illegally, but I'm looking at the Uber type situation. It'll be somewhere down the track when we're already using all these models already to make our lives, to run our lives and run our economy. It'll be not too late. It'll be too late to stop it if we wanted to stop it. I think we should manage it, not stop it. The way of managing is actually saying you are going to be accountable for what you're doing and how you're using it. And the people that actually read the stack, the technology stack, there's somebody in that stack, just like in the factory, there's somebody in that factory who's accountable. And there's somebody in that factory who's more accountable. And there's somewhere in that stack that's more accountable. And I think that's how we evolve the regulatory environment, just like we have for cars.
Just to round it off, did you finish this inquiry thinking that aspiration is doable? Do you think it is actually possible to hold this technology to an extent that it does good rather than bad? Or did you walk away thinking these are big, powerful actors, they're not going to care what we do, they're going to do it anyway?
Oh, this technology does do good. That's. I mean, I sort of said, we've concentrated on a lot of the things that are negative, but like being able to work, create cement now, out of that great, US university, 40% less, carbon emission as a result of using AI, and finding some of those answers. So I think that there's. I'm confident that we can actually hold them to account. I'm confident that we can build a public view both within Australia and in parts of the world that are going to be influential enough to actually influence the outcomes. I think it's just like everything else that's complicated when society goes through leaps and changes, that we have to make sure we regulate it in a fashion, not stop it. stopping it is just ludicrous. That's a fool's objective. Uber is a good example of a company now who's actually done an international arrangement with the trade union movement worldwide about having labour standards. They've signed off an international agreement. I was at a conference 6 weeks ago where there's 47 countries, 300 unions, in many circumstances, not all, but in many circumstances, Uber working with those unions to come up with regulatory models in those countries within that international frame. So I've got a great deal of hope. Is it moving quickly enough for me? No, never will. But have I got confidence we can pull it off? Absolutely.
Look, thanks, Tony, and thanks a lot for your work and the work of your committee. I know there were some good players on that team that you worked with, not just from one side of politics either. So it's a good contribution. Look, we're almost at the end. This is the final Burning Platforms of the year. We did have aspirations for a live show, as we always do, and the year's just killed us. So I did want to finish it off just with, particularly thanking Lizzie and Dan for hanging around this year and also for all our guests, but maybe to finish it off with a prediction for 2025. We could have done this with audience involvement if we got our act together, Dan, but what's your prediction for 2025?
I have a very hopeful one, which I can't believe I think is possible. But
it is Christmas time.
But it is Christmas. But I think that finally, we're going to see Google lose its grip on search. And I think that is going to be a very good thing because Google largely controls the digital economy now and does so in opaque ways, as I've talked about previously. But why I think this is going to happen, by the way, is, look, I'm probably not reflective of the general population, but just in my own behaviour and certainly a lot of the people that I'm friends with, the use of OpenAI in particular with chatgpt to answer search queries far more effectively than Google now is phenomenal. Like, I'm now using that more than Google, and I suspect that the rest of the population will be doing something pretty similar soon. And it also, if that is the case, then I think that other companies that have so far not entered search but which have a really large consumer base are going to start their own AI-driven models will start to eat into Google's lunch a little bit. So I think we're going to see that with Apple Intelligence and them finally getting their act together with Siri, which is still a pretty woeful product, but I think we'll finally start to become decent. This might not be a good thing, but I think we'll also see it with Meta AI. I think that it's already answering a lot of search queries within their own environments now. And then we've got some new challenges, again, not necessarily ones that are all that good given their past behaviour, but Perplexity and others. And I also think because we're finally going to see some antitrust action against Google being forced to divest Chrome, I think all of these things combined mean that the search economy and the search domination, if you like, of Google is finally going to start to slip. And I think we're already seeing it, and I think it's going to get real momentum in 2025, and I'm here for it.
Well, Lizzie, I know you're a very Christmassy person. What have you got for 25 to put under the tree?
Well, this is funny because I don't use these products in the way that Dan does at all. So I have the different personal experience of it. I wouldn't trust ChatGPT to Google anything, to be honest. But anyway, it's funny because I had like the reverse instinct in some ways. I feel like the move to break up potentially Google, which came about through the DOJ in the US, may end up facing challenges under a Trump administration who's looking to shake up as much as possible all these departments, including potentially dismantling large aspects of executive government, lots of people losing their job. I think it's a tragedy because Lena Khan, the head of the FTC, I think has been doing amazing work. Her term has expired and she could be reappointed, but no one in the Biden administration has moved to do that, which seems like a tragedy. And I think it's partly that's like a function of why they lost the last election. The Kamala Harris did not campaign on that as being a positive legacy. And in fact, I think it's something that they should be owning. It's a good thing, and it's it's things people instinctively understand, that holding big tech companies, other companies to account for anti-competitive behaviour, that's a vote winner. And it seems like a terrible shame. And I sort of foresee a future in which Lina Khan isn't reappointed. Hopefully I get to eat my hat before January and Joe Biden does do so. But that will have to mean that we'll have to think of other ways in which we can take power back from big tech that don't involve regulatory agencies that have the mandate to do so through a consumer competition lens.
Although it is worth noting that JD Vance is a fan of Lina Khan, and so there is a slim bit of hope. I think it's unlikely too, but a slim
You are very
bit of
hopeful
hope.
tonight, Dan.
It's Christmas. It's Christmas. It's almost.
It's my
It's
role,
early,
isn't it?
It's early December. Look, the Melbourne Cup's been run and won. It's Christmas. My bit of positivity is I wish to see 2025 as the year of small language models and starting to think about how the technology can be used, not just with these global sort of everythings, but actually using the technology to solve problems in a granular way with a focus that use a whole lot less energy, have a whole lot less impact. I think the most inspiring work I've been exposed to this year is some of the work coming out of the Human Technology Institute with Dr. Sally Cripps, using small bits of information to come up with better models for protecting at-risk kids. And it's not about getting an open AI to solve the problem for you and predict what word's coming next. It's using the same sorts of methodologies to really interrogate deep, granular data, and I find that really exciting. But I don't know, Tony, apart from a Labor win at some stage in the first half of next year, any positive before we close up?
Well, I can't get much more positive than that, Pete. You just stole my thunder. But since you have, I'll come with something else. But I predict that in 2025 that the winner of the ARI Awards will be The Engine.
And who might The Engine be, Tony?
Well, that is my son's band. So, like, they're a version of the Pixies, but with a harder edge. They're sort of grunge punk band. So I think they're pretty damn good. So
they sound right up my alley for what it's worth. I'll have to check them out.
No AI involved in the making of their albums?
Absolutely no AI whatsoever.
You'd disown them, wouldn't you?
I would. Well, I'd be disappointed by whether I disown's another question. But I just want to round off on that. I think on your opening piece, I predict that we're going to have a lot more enterprise agreements with artificial intelligence arrangements in there, and I think there's going to be pushback from companies because of concern about an unfettered right to do what they want. But just like Woolworths, I'll come to a reality, and that'll start setting the agenda for what should be happening about proper conversations, proper risk management, and working out best to use AI rather than just how to use it and abuse it.
Well, that's a great way to finish the show. Ending where we started, the year is a cycle. It's all a turning. So look forward to seeing you all in 2025. Thanks for those that have listened to us. You're a select crew, but the numbers have been growing, and we hope to see you in person next year. But for now, thanks a lot, and good night, everyone. That is the final episode of Burning Platforms for 2024. Thanks for being on the journey this year. The show was recorded on December 10 and produced on Naarm land by Capita's Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.